The sun bled into the city's veins as Marcus Reed headed home. But when a young cop's hand twitched toward his weapon, tension thick as a shroud, and a suffocating silence pressed in, a voice, calm and unyielding, shattered the air. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." What followed was more than a moment of intervention. It was a watershed. It was a time when divisions weren't just crossed, but dismantled, and the deafening cost of inaction was finally silenced. My friends, what you're about to see isn't just a tale. It's a powerful testament to the quiet force of justice in the places we often overlook. If this is your first time here, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories like this challenge your perspective, stir your soul, or spark a new thought, consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon. We share voices that must be heard every single day. Thank you for joining us. Now let's dive into the story. The river below was a dark, rippling mirror, catching the final gleam of a dying sun. The air hung heavy with the scent of rain that had yet to fall, its promise thick as smoke. Marcus Reed was a solitary figure on the pedestrian path of the Brooklyn Bridge, a man in the deepening twilight. The city behind him hummed, a gentle chorus of distant car horns and the hushed rhythm of evening commuters. For years this bridge had been his sanctuary, a silent witness to countless sunsets. He'd walked it after long days of teaching, leaving behind the weight of lesson plans and the quiet ache of his own lost dreams. But tonight was different. The air itself felt charged, fragile as glass. A faint scuff of footsteps behind him put him on high alert. He turned just enough to glimpse the silhouette of a man emerging from the shadows. He was young, his uniform sharp, and his eyes were too wide, too jittery. The officer's hand was already on the grip of his gun, fingers trembling with anticipation. "Hey, hands where I can see them." The words were a sharp slice through the quiet, their echo bouncing off steel and stone. Marcus froze, his heart fluttering like a caged bird. The world shrank to the glint of a badge, the sheen of a holster, the raw edge of authority. His mouth was dry as desert dust as he slowly turned to face the officer. "You match the description of a suspect," the cop snapped, his voice taut with a feeling that was either fear or something more predatory. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. "I'm just walking home," he said, his voice steady, a practiced calm that came from a lifetime of knowing what could happen if he flinched. "I don't know what suspect you're talking about." The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "Don't get cute. Turn around now." The sky was ablaze with streaks of orange and crimson, but all Marcus could see was the world closing in on him, the tightening knot of suspicion. His mind raced not with panic but with a flood of memories. Headlines, funerals, hollow apologies. His hands were steady but his breath was shallow, too fast. He thought of his students, of the little boy who had cried last week after being called a name he didn't understand, of the lesson he taught them about standing tall and speaking truth, even when your voice shakes. But this wasn't a classroom. This was a bridge, a badge, and a gun. He was about to try to reason with the officer when a voice, low and commanding, cut through the tension like a knife. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." It came from further down the bridge, from a place where light bent and shadows deepened. Marcus's eyes darted toward the figure leaning against the railing, a man half hidden in the gathering gloom. He was older, his silhouette etched against the dark shimmer of the water. His voice was gravelly, worn by years, but it carried a weight that made the young officer hesitate. "Who the hell are you?" the cop barked, his gun still holstered but trembling. The man straightened, stepping forward. The setting sun caught his face, dark-skinned with eyes sharp as shattered glass. He moved with the patient, deliberate gait of someone who had seen too many young men make foolish choices. "Just a concerned citizen," he said, his voice mild. "But if you're thinking of arresting Mr. Reed here, you might want to know who you're dealing with." The officer's face clouded with confusion. The name Reed landed like a stone in the quiet. Marcus felt his breath catch. The man knew his name. The stranger's jacket shifted as he moved closer, revealing the glint of a gold badge clipped to his belt. The insignia gleamed in the fading light, unmistakable. "Deputy Commissioner Elijah Brooks," he said softly, his voice as calm as the river's surface. "And you, officer, are making a very serious mistake." For a moment everything stopped. The bridge, the city, even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. The young officer's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. "Sir, I didn't what?" Brooks's voice was quiet, but it was laced with steel. Didn't check your facts? Didn't think a black man could walk home on his own bridge without being a suspect. Marcus's hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. The words felt like a punch to the gut, but they weren't for him. They were for the badge, the holster, the uniformed man who was now trembling under their weight. Brooks stepped closer, his tone colder than the river's chill. This is a bridge too far. Hand over your badge and your weapon now. Silence. The bridge seemed to shudder with it, the sky deepening to a bruised purple as the last light vanished. Marcus felt the knot in his chest loosen, but a tremor remained in his limbs. His breath came slow and measured, but inside a storm raged. A maelstrom of fear, anger, and something older, something his grandfather had called resilience. The officer, young and visibly shaken, fumbled at his belt, unhooked his badge and gun, and handed them over with trembling hands. Brooks took them, tucking them away with a casual ease that spoke volumes. Then he turned to Marcus, his gaze softening. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "You're free to go." Marcus nodded, his voice catching. "Thank you," he murmured, the words tasting strange on his tongue. But as he turned to leave, his steps heavy and slow, he realized this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The city still whispered, the bridge still stretched out like a question, waiting for an answer. And he knew deep in his bones that this night, this bridge would haunt him for a long time. Some bridges are built to be crossed. Others are meant to be burned. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone shows up to help you rebuild them before it's too late. That night, Marcus Reed couldn't sleep. His small West Side apartment, usually a refuge, felt suffocating. The echoes of the confrontation on the Brooklyn Bridge ricocheted through his mind, a rhythm that wouldn't let him rest. He paced the worn floorboards, every shadow feeling deeper, every corner sharper, as if the darkness itself was closing in. He replayed the scene, the young officer's sharp commands, the calm authority of Deputy Commissioner Elijah Brooks. It had been a narrow escape, a moment on the brink of tragedy. But what gnawed at Marcus wasn't just the fear. It was the brutal truth Brooks had revealed. This wasn't just about him. It was about a collective burden that pressed down on men who looked like him every single day. By dawn he had made a choice. The sunrise painted his apartment in fragile gold, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside him. He dressed meticulously as if preparing for battle, in his teacher's uniform of a clean button-down and slacks. He wouldn't let this moment fade. He wouldn't let it become another silent story or another knowing nod between strangers. He arrived at PS 47 earlier than usual. The school, nestled between a bakery and a laundromat, was already stirring. Teachers shuffled in, exchanging weary greetings. Marcus slipped into his classroom, a place that had always been his sanctuary. Bright posters lined the walls and student projects hung proudly. But today the room felt different. It felt like a stage. As the morning bell rang and children filtered in, Marcus forced a smile. He guided them through lessons, read from worn books, and corrected math problems. But the weight in his chest made his voice catch and his hand tremble. The kids noticed. They were sharp, perceptive, and far more attuned to adult tensions than anyone gave them credit for. During lunch, he found himself alone in the teacher's lounge, his thoughts heavy. The news was on the TV, muted, showing a protest in another part of the city. He couldn't hear the chants, but he knew the words by heart. Justice, equality, enough. It was then that Principal Sharon Martinez entered, her presence a steadying force. A tall woman with a commanding voice and a heart that had seen the school through countless storms, she sat across from him, her eyes steady and kind. "Marcus," she said, her voice low. "I heard about what happened last night." He looked up, startled. "You did?" "Word travels fast," she replied. "And I can see it in you today. You're here, but part of you isn't." He hesitated, the familiar urge to brush it off rising in his throat. But her gaze held him, unflinching. "I'm tired," he admitted. "Tired of pretending everything is fine. Tired of having to be careful all the time." Martinez nodded slowly. "You're not alone in that. But you're not powerless either. What you do here every day matters. And what happened on that bridge? People need to hear about it. Not just whispers. They need to see someone standing up." He swallowed hard, her words hitting him deeply. He had spent so long keeping his head down, believing that being good, being calm, being kind would protect him. But calm hadn't protected him on that bridge. Deputy Commissioner Brooks had. And not everyone had a Brooks to stand beside them. That afternoon, as the final bell rang, Marcus remained at his desk. He stared at the sunlight streaming through the dusty windows, his thoughts swirling like the dust motes in the light. He thought of his father, a man who had worked 2 jobs and taught Marcus he had to be twice as good to be considered half as much. He thought of his students, of little Jason who had cried after being mocked, and of Maria who was afraid to raise her hand. Marcus rose, his chair scraping softly. He made a decision, not with a grand speech, but with the quiet resolve of a man who knew change begins in small, deliberate steps. He opened his laptop and began drafting an email to the school board, local representatives, and the mayor's office. He described what had happened, not just the facts but the human cost, the fear in his gut, the shame of standing frozen while someone else fought for his dignity. And he asked, no, he demanded, that they do better. The next morning he stood outside the school watching as parents dropped off their children. He greeted each one with a smile, but inside he was bracing himself. The story was already spreading. Some colleagues offered support while others shifted uncomfortably. But Marcus was undeterred. He met their gazes, steady and unflinching. He was no longer just a teacher keeping his head down. He was a man taking a stand. Then, like a ripple in a still pond, it began. Parents approached him quietly, offering words of encouragement. A father nodded, his eyes filled with respect. A mother squeezed his hand, her grip firm. Even his students sensed the shift, their eyes brighter, their questions bolder. They saw him not just as Mr. Reed, their teacher, but as a man who stood for something. That afternoon, as rain finally broke over the city, Marcus stood at his classroom window, watching the drops streak down the glass. His reflection stared back at him, tired but resolute. He realized the bridge hadn't been just a moment of fear. It had been a test. And now, as the rain fell, washing the city clean, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. Because sometimes standing up isn't a choice. It's a necessity. And Marcus Reed was done sitting down. In the days that followed, the world felt slightly off-kilter, as if it had shifted on its axis. The air carried a new weight, and the streets of Brooklyn hummed with whispers that Marcus could almost hear as he walked. He had never intended to become a symbol, nor did he imagine his quiet stand would resonate so widely. Yet there it was, the community's eyes on him, some curious, some reverent, a few clouded by suspicion. Amidst it all, something unexpected began to happen. Bridges of trust, once considered impossible to build, started to form. One morning, as he locked his apartment door, he saw an older woman on the corner. When their eyes met, she hesitated, then stepped forward. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a long life. "Thank you for what you did. My grandson walks home over that bridge every day." The knot in Marcus's chest loosened. "I just did what was necessary," he said, feeling the words were insufficient. "No," she said firmly. "You did what many of us are too afraid to do. You reminded me that maybe we don't have to be afraid forever." As she walked away, Marcus stood for a moment, absorbing the gravity of her words. They weren't just words of gratitude. They were a declaration of trust, a sign that his actions had planted a seed of belief in people who had long been told to keep their heads down. In the weeks that followed, Marcus noticed these subtle bridges everywhere. At school, his students were more attentive, their questions more thoughtful. They were starting to realize that the world outside their classroom, a world of bias and fear, could be challenged. His colleagues, who had kept a polite distance, now lingered in the break room, their conversations more meaningful. Even parents at pickup time offered nods of respect, their guarded expressions softening. One evening, as dusk painted the city in purple and gold, Marcus found himself at a community center near Prospect Park. The local neighborhood association had organized a forum for residents to voice their concerns. Though he was not a public speaker, something inside him compelled him to go. The center was packed, the air thick with the scent of coffee and nervous energy. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as neighbors young and old took their seats. When Marcus was invited to speak, he hesitated for only a heartbeat before rising. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders, and then he spoke, not with practiced rhetoric, but with the raw honesty of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. "I was just walking home," he began, his voice steady but intense. "But that night on the bridge reminded me of something we all know deep down. Our silence isn't safety. It's complicity. And if we don't stand up, if we don't speak, then nothing changes. The room remained still, the usual hum of murmuring gone. People were truly listening. I don't have all the answers, Marcus continued. I'm a teacher, not a politician. But I know what it feels like to be judged before you speak, to be feared for the color of your skin, to be seen as a threat just for existing. And I know that none of you should have to live like that. A murmur rippled through the audience, followed by a shift in the air as heads nodded and hands clenched. Marcus felt the momentum building, invisible threads of trust weaving through the crowd. I'm not asking anyone to fight with fists or weapons, he said. I'm asking us to fight with our voices, with our presence. To show up, to hold each other accountable, to say, this isn't right and I won't be a part of it. The applause that followed wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a steady rhythm of solidarity that echoed through the walls. Marcus sat down, his heart pounding, his hands trembling slightly. Beside him, a young woman leaned over and whispered, "Thank you. My brother was harassed by the police last year and he's been too scared to speak out. Maybe now he'll find the courage." In the weeks that followed, the shift became more visible. A neighborhood once defined by unspoken fears was slowly, subtly changing. Community meetings grew more frequent and diverse. People began sharing stories that had been buried for years, surfacing now like long-lost treasures. Parents walked their children home with a new sense of purpose. Elders spoke up at council meetings. Teenagers organized cleanups and outreach events. Through it all, Marcus kept teaching. His classroom became a place where the seeds of these new bridges took root. He encouraged his students to ask difficult questions, to explore uncomfortable truths, and to see each other as allies. He invited community speakers to share their experiences and created projects that celebrated diversity and resilience. The walls of his classroom, once decorated with simple charts, now bore murals painted by his students. Murals of bridges, both literal and metaphorical, spanning divides and connecting people of all backgrounds. One crisp Saturday morning, as the neighborhood gathered for a community cleanup, Marcus worked alongside Elijah Brooks. The deputy commissioner had come without fanfare, dressed in jeans and a faded sweatshirt. He worked quietly, picking up trash, planting flowers, and helping to repair the playground. When their eyes met, there was a silent understanding between them, a recognition of the delicate, powerful bridges they were building together. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the faces of the volunteers, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not the fragile, fleeting hope that fades with the setting sun, but the kind that lodges deep in the bones, the kind that turns ordinary days into movements and silence into song. And though he knew the road ahead was long, Marcus Reed stood taller, his resolve unshaken. These bridges of trust weren't just for him. They were for everyone, for the children he taught, for the neighbors he now stood beside, for the generations to come. It was a bridge they were all building together, one stone at a time. The shift in perspective didn't happen all at once, like a sudden break in a storm. Instead, it unfolded gradually, as if the world had decided to turn itself over inch by inch. For Marcus Reed, each inch was a hard-won victory, every step a move away from the shadows of fear and into something that resembled understanding. Yet as the weeks passed, the weight of what he had started became clear. In his classroom, Marcus noticed it first. His students, once shy and hesitant to speak of things beyond school, were finding their voices. One morning, a young boy named Isaiah, who usually kept his head down, raised his hand to share a story about his uncle's wrongful arrest. The entire room listened, silent and respectful. When Isaiah finished, Marcus saw something shift in his classmates, a shared recognition that connected them beyond their desks. Marcus knew these moments were vital. They were seeds planted in soil long considered barren. But what surprised him most was how his own perspective was evolving. On that bridge, he had felt like a victim, a man who had stumbled upon an injustice. Now, as he walked the streets of Brooklyn and spoke with his neighbors, he realized he had become something else. A witness not only to the actions of others but to the quiet power of resilience dormant in his community. He began to see stories where there had once been silence. The older man who ran the corner bodega shared how he had been harassed by police in his youth but never spoken of it. A middle-aged mother confided her fear for her teenage son, staying up every night until he was home safe. Even the whispers of skeptical passers-by became, in his mind, invitations to engage, to offer a counter-narrative that might just chip away at years of mistrust. His understanding of the police force also changed. In Deputy Commissioner Elijah Brooks, he saw not just a man defined by his badge, but a human being struggling to reconcile his position with the realities faced by the community he served. In their quiet conversations, Marcus listened as Elijah spoke of the complexities of change, the resistance within the ranks, and his own frustrations. These exchanges were difficult but necessary. They shifted Marcus's view of the system from an unyielding monolith to a complicated, imperfect structure that required persistent collective effort to reform. One evening, Marcus stood by his window, the city's pulse beating beyond the glass. The weight of his new responsibility settled over him like a heavy but familiar coat. He thought of the young officer from the bridge, the way his hands had trembled, the fear in his eyes. What had become of him? Had he learned anything, or had the experience only hardened him? Marcus found himself hoping, almost against reason, that the confrontation had left a mark, that the young officer, too, was grappling with a shifting perspective. The realization that real change was a gradual awakening, not a swift revolution, didn't diminish Marcus's resolve. If anything, it strengthened it. He knew that each conversation, each moment of recognition, each bridge built of trust and understanding, was a small but vital victory. And though the burden was heavy, he carried it willingly for the sake of those who had no choice but to shoulder it alongside him. As dawn painted the city in pale gold and silver, Marcus felt a quiet determination. The road ahead was long and fraught with obstacles, but he no longer walked it alone. He was part of a shifting tide, one that could, if nurtured with care and persistence, reshape the way his community and perhaps the broader world understood justice, resilience, and the fragile, powerful art of building bridges between divides. As the city woke beneath the soft light of dawn, Marcus Reed found himself once more on the familiar bridge. The air was cool, the river below a calm whisper that felt almost foreign after the recent storm. This was no longer just a path home. It was a marker of resilience, a silent witness to the collision of injustice and courage that had reverberated through the community. But as Marcus stood there, his thoughts were not on the confrontation itself, but on what came after. The quiet, persistent work of healing, of mending trust, of building something stronger. He thought of the conversations that had followed, in classrooms, community centers, and over kitchen tables. He recalled how Elijah Brooks, once just a name in the system, had become a face, a voice, and an ally who carried the weight of change from within. It wasn't a perfect alliance, nothing ever is. But it was real, and that mattered. Marcus remembered the students who had found their courage, who spoke their truths not with anger, but with the clear-eyed resolve of those who had seen too much to stay silent. He thought of Isaiah's trembling voice, of the quiet nods exchanged between neighbors, of the mothers who now walked a little taller. And then there was the young officer. He had reached out months later, not with a formal apology, but with a quiet request to talk. They met in a small coffee shop by the river, two men on opposite sides of a chasm that had begun to narrow. The young officer spoke of fear, of ignorance, of a system that had taught him to see threats where there were none. Marcus listened, not to forgive or forget, but to understand. In that understanding, a bridge was built, not of iron and stone, but of human connection and hard-won trust. Standing at the edge of the bridge, Marcus allowed himself a rare smile. The city was waking around him, its sounds both familiar and reassuring. He knew the work was far from over. Change doesn't come with a single confrontation or a few heartfelt conversations. It comes in waves, in the steady push of voices refusing to be silenced, in the shared resolve of communities learning to stand together. As the sun broke over the horizon, spilling gold over the water, Marcus made a quiet promise, not just to himself, but to everyone who had stood beside him, who had dared to believe in something better. This bridge, once a place of division and fear, was now a symbol of renewal, of the power of persistence and connection. And as he turned to walk home, Marcus knew with certainty that no force, no prejudice, could ever break what they had built between them. This bridge was not just renewed, it was unbreakable. In the calm aftermath of turmoil, Marcus Reed's journey stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of connection. What began as an ordinary walk home spiraled into a confrontation that exposed not just individual prejudice, but systemic flaws long overlooked. Yet it was not the crisis itself that defined Marcus, but what followed. the conversations, the bridge building, the unwavering pursuit of understanding and justice. His story unfolded across city streets and community halls, in whispered apologies and fierce declarations. Each piece threaded together a tapestry of change that was both deeply personal and sweeping. Marcus's evolution from a victim of misjudgment to a beacon of perseverance revealed the quiet strength that comes from standing tall against adversity. He didn't seek revenge. Instead, he chose the harder path of dialogue and reconciliation. His interactions with Elijah Brooks, an officer who chose integrity over silence, and with the young officer who reached out in regret, highlighted the profound impact one person's courage can have on those around them. Marcus's story isn't one of solitary heroism, but of collective resilience, reminding us that true change requires many voices speaking in unison. The lesson from Marcus's journey is both timeless and timely. Lasting change isn't born from dramatic gestures but from persistent effort, honest conversations, and a willingness to bridge divides. In a world where divisions, racial, political, economic, continue to threaten our shared humanity, Marcus's story is a clarion call to action. It reminds us that while we may not control the actions of others, we can choose how we respond. We can choose to listen, to stand firm in our convictions, and to extend a hand across divides, even when the path forward seems uncertain. Let Marcus Reed's story inspire you to be the bridge in your community, to recognize the humanity in those who seem different, to speak up when silence feels safer, and to build connections where walls once stood. And if his story moved you, if it sparked a new perspective or a flicker of hope, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support not only fuels our passion for sharing stories that matter but also helps build a community where change isn't just a dream, but a daily commitment. Together we can keep these important conversations alive and forge a future rooted in understanding, courage, and unity.